1. c4 is the English opening. A flexible move that controls the d5 square and prepares to build a solid pawn center or challenge. Black's central control. This move initiates the king's Indian defense. A dynamic system where black plans to fianchetto the king's bishop and challenge white's central control later in the game. This move transitions into a ready opening setup, allowing for flexible pawn structures and a rapid development of minor pieces, often leading to strategic maneuvering games rather than immediate tactical skirmishes. This move, 2, e6, signals black's intention to enter a queen's Indian defense or a Nimzo Indian defense setup, preparing to challenge white's central control with the bishop on c8 and the f-pawn. This move maintains flexibility, allowing white to transpose into various queen's pawn openings depending on black's response, while developing a central piece and preparing for kingside castling. This move introduces the queen's Indian defense, aiming to control the d4 square and develop the kingside quickly while allowing the queenside bishop to fianchetto. By advancing the e-pawn, white stakes a strong claim in the center, challenging black's queenside fianchetto and potentially opening lines for development and tactical play. This move develops the bishop to a good diagonal, preparing to challenge white's central pawn majority and potentially pressure the d4 square. This move, k2, prepares to castle kingside and supports the e4 pawn while potentially facilitating a queenside rook lift later in the game. Black immediately challenges white's nc3, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially create imbalances by exchanging the bishop for the knight. This move aggressively pushes the e-pawn, challenging black's knight and aiming to restrict its mobility while opening lines for white's pieces. The move ing8 is a retreat, often seen in variations of the queen's Indian defense where black aims to resolve positional tension rather than immediately challenging white's central pawn push with d6. White reinforces control of the central squares, preparing to develop the bishop to a more active square and potentially challenge black's pawn structure. This move continues black's defensive setup, aiming to solidify the kingside and prepare to develop the remaining pieces, potentially contesting white's central pawn. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, supporting the central pawn advance and preparing for potential kingside castling while also potentially eyeing weaknesses on the queenside. This move, 8, d5, is a crucial pawn break aiming to challenge white's central control and open lines for black's pieces, particularly for the queen's bishop and the knight on g8. By capturing on d6, white resolves the central tension, opens the e-file for potential future activity, and initiates a pawn structure shift that may lead to a more dynamic game. This pawn capture clarifies the central pawn structure, opening the c-file for potential pressure while preparing to recapture with the pawn to complete white's central pawn control. This move aims to challenge black's bishop, potentially gaining a tempo and disrupting black's development if the bishop retreats to a less active square. This move exchanges the bishop for a knight, simplifying the position and opening the c-file, potentially allowing black to challenge white's central pawn structure more effectively. The recapture with the queen opens the d-file for potential rook activity and develops the queen to a more active central square, though it now occupies the same file as black's advanced pawn. This move prepares to redeploy the knight from its passive square on g8 towards more active central squares, a common theme when black's kingside knight is forced back. This move develops the bishop, preparing to castle and connect the rooks, while also potentially aiming at the weakened d5 pawn. This move correctly occupies the open c-file, challenging white's queen and preparing to contest control of this important central file. Castling kingside secures the king's safety and connects the rooks, preparing them for active play along the open d-file. The move 13:00 is a logical step to safeguard the king, centralize pieces, and prepare for potential counterplay on the queenside, while white has achieved a strong central pawn presence, developing the bishop to a more active square and preparing to challenge black's knight on d7, aiming to simplify and exploit the open c-file. This move aims to challenge white's well-placed bishop on g5, preventing it from potentially coordinating with other pieces and forcing a decision about its future placement. This move prepares to exchange the bishop for the knight, aiming to weaken black's kingside pawn structure and gain an open g-file for white's rook. This move prepares to bring the queen to a more active square on the kingside and potentially support a pawn advance with f5, while also clearing the e8 square for the rook. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to control the important light squares and prepare for potential pawn breaks or attacks on black's kingside. This move challenges white's central control and opens up possibilities for black's pieces, aiming to disrupt the pawn structure and gain initiative on the kingside. The bishop retreats to f4, reinforcing the center and preparing to redeploy to a more active square, potentially g3 or even h2 to eye black's kingside. This move aims to gain queenside space and potentially challenge white's pawn structure on that side of the board. This move reorganizes the bishop to a more active square, preparing to contest the d-file and support potential pawn advances on the queenside. This move is a preparatory step, intending to reroute the queen to a more active square and potentially support a kingside pawn advance or reinforce central control. This exchange resolves black's central tension and clarifies white's pawn structure, opening up the d-file for potential activity. This move solidifies black's central pawn structure, creating a passed pawn on e5 that can become a valuable attacking asset in the upcoming middle game. This move brings the rook to an active file, aiming to exploit the open e-file and support a potential central pawn advance or pressure on black's king. This move brings the queen to a more active square, preparing to potentially contest the d-file or support a kingside advance, while also defending the f5 pawn from immediate attack. This move intends to open the d-file for the queen and potentially create dynamic play by exploiting black's doubled f-pawns and vulnerable kingside. This move sacrifices the exchange for active piece play and opens the c-file, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create attacking chances. The exchange of queens simplifies the position, heading towards an endgame where white's central pawn majority on d5 might become a long-term asset after the material is cleared. This move recaptures a pawn and simplifies the position, but it strategically places the knight on a less active square, allowing white to centralize their pieces more effectively. This move is a critical tactical shot that exploits black's compromised pawn structure on the queenside, aiming to win material by capturing the d6 pawn after black's rook is tied to the defense of the c4 pawn. This move repositions the rook to the c-file, creating doubled pressure on white's isolated d5 pawn and preparing for potential central pawn breaks or exchanges to activate black's pieces. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to exploit the open c-file and potentially put pressure on black's queenside pawns. This move is a critical tactical decision to regain material equality by exploiting the undefended knight on d6. This move redeploys the knight to a more active central square, preparing to contest the control of the d-file and potentially support a kingside pawn advance or exploit weaknesses in black's position. This move aims to dislodge white's well-placed knight and simplify the position, though it does weaken black's kingside pawn structure. This move decisively wins a pawn, creating a dangerous passed pawn on the d-file and significantly improving white's positional advantage due to black's weakened pawn structure. This exchange simplifies the material, but it leaves white with a structurally sound position and more active pieces, while black's queenside pawns are weakened and the king remains exposed. This knight maneuver boldly occupies a central outpost, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares and restrict black's king's activity while preparing to infiltrate further into black's territory. This move activates the knight to a central outpost, aiming to support potential pawn advances on the kingside and disrupt white's pieces. This move aims to exploit white's material advantage by trading off black's active rook and simplifying into a winning endgame with an extra pawn. The knight's maneuver to d3 aims to provoke a reaction from white's kingside pawns, potentially creating weaknesses or opening lines for attack. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside and potentially create threats against black's pawn structure. Black recaptures the knight, centralizing the knight and aiming to untangle their pieces. But white's advanced d-pawn now presents a significant positional advantage. This move removes the advanced knight on c4, simplifying the position and aiming to exploit white's potential pawn majority on the queenside, while preventing black's knight from becoming a powerful outpost on d3. Black recaptures the knight, simplifying into a potentially favorable endgame where their rook on the open c-file and passed d-pawn offer counterplay against white's exposed king. This move aims to regain the sacrificed pawn by targeting the weak c2 pawn and forcing black to defend it, disrupting their pawn structure and piece coordination. This move aims to simplify the position by trading off the powerful knight on d6, leading to an endgame where black has a passed pawn on d5 and white's king is somewhat exposed. This knight move aims to regain the pawn on c2, which is currently undefended, and simultaneously prepares to control the critical d3 square after white recaptures. This move repositions the rook to the 7th rank, creating an outpost and attacking white's isolated d-pawn while preparing to contest the open d-file. This rook move activates the piece to its maximum potential on the open c-file, contesting black's control and preparing for potential threats on the queenside or central advancements. Black's knight aggressively moves to d4, targeting the weakened c2 square and threatening to infiltrate white's position, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and create active counterplay in this complex endgame. This checks the king and forces the opponent to block, creating an open file for your rook and potentially leading to a decisive attack. The king steps out of the line of fire from the rook and bishop battery, seeking refuge on the kingside where potential threats are less immediate. This move aims to create space for the king by preventing potential checks on the g-file and preparing for king activity in the endgame. Black captures the pawn on b2, opening up the b-file for potential pressure and challenging white's pawn structure, aiming to exploit the exposed white king. This rook move initiates a critical maneuver to reclaim the pawn on b2 and simplify the position, aiming to convert the material advantage in the endgame. This move initiates a tactical sequence to exploit the overloaded rook on a8, aiming to capture the knight and simplify into a winning endgame with an extra pawn. Moving the king to h2 is a prudent defensive maneuver, creating a safe haven away from the dangerous diagonal of the opponent's knight and allowing the rook to potentially join the defense on the kingside if needed. This knight maneuver aims to pressure white's weakened pawn structure on the kingside and prepare for potential counterplay, seeking to exploit the slightly exposed position of the white king. The king's retreat to g1 aims to create a safer square away from the active knight on f4, preparing for potential further king maneuvers or to support pawn advances on the kingside should the opportunity arise. The knight's repositioning to d3 aims to provoke a favorable pawn structure by forcing white's knight from b7 to either defend or retreat, while also preparing for potential breakthroughs on the kingside or center. nd6 redeploys the knight to a strong central outpost, aiming to disrupt black's coordinated pieces and potentially target weaknesses on the queenside. This move captures a piece and aims to create a passed pawn, but critically neglects the defense of your king, allowing white's knight to achieve a strong central outpost. The capture on a7 is a desperate attempt to win material back, but it overlooks the tactical sequence that allows black to force a queen exchange and simplify into a winning endgame. This move aims to activate the knight by bringing it closer to the center, potentially supporting a central pawn push or preparing to contest key squares, while also defending the g4 pawn, which is currently under attack. This move is intended to prepare a kingside pawn push, potentially g4, to create space and activate the king or attack black's knight. This move is a speculative attempt to exploit white's potentially overextended king by bringing the knight to the vulnerable e3 square, aiming to create threats against the white king and possibly trap the rook. The king retreats to the corner to avoid potential checks along the h-file, consolidating its position while preparing for a potential defense or future maneuvering. This move aims to activate the king, shifting it towards the queenside pawns, while also preparing to defend the vulnerable h-pawn and potentially coordinate with the knight to create counterplay. The rook on b7 aims to control the open b-file, preventing black from easily activating their rook and potentially creating threats against white's queenside pawns. This move repositions the rook to the second rank, preparing to contest the open d-file and potentially support advances on the queenside or create threats against white's king. This move capitalizes on white's superior piece activity and favorable pawn structure to regain material, aiming to simplify into a winning endgame by exploiting the undefended pawn on b5. The knight's return to f5 aims to reposition for defense of the kingside and potentially support a g6 push to create a safer haven for the king, while also eyeing the pawn on d5. This move is an attempt to activate the g-pawn, aiming to challenge black's well-placed knight on e3 and potentially create a passed pawn later in the endgame. This move sacrifices the knight to expose white's king and force further material concessions, aiming to exploit the advanced pawn structure and create a mating attack. This move aims to reposition the king to a safer square, likely to avoid potential checks or tactical skirmishes on the kingside following black's recent pawn push. The king is exposed on the kingside after black's knight penetrates, and this move forces the white king to a more secure square on the kingside, solidifying white's defensive setup. This move aims to centralize the king for defense and potential counterplay after black's aggressive kingside advances. This move allows black to regain the sacrificed pawn and solidify their position, setting up further counterplay with the rook on the now open g-file. The rook's advance to a7 activates it on the open file, aiming to disrupt black's kingside pawn structure and potentially create threats against the weakened king. This move seeks to exploit the now open g-file to pressure white's king and potentially create counterplay. But it leaves the d5 pawn undefended and allows white to regroup and reinforce. White prepares to push the a-pawn, aiming to expand on the queenside and potentially create a passed pawn to distract black's pieces or restrict their mobility. The move creates a passed pawn on h5, aiming to advance it towards promotion and potentially open up attacking avenues for the black king. The move a5 aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside by undermining black's control of the queenside pawn majority and potentially supporting the advance of the a-pawn. With white having committed to the advance of the a-pawn, black seizes the opportunity to advance the h-pawn, creating potential counterplay and aiming to disturb white's king's position. White's rook aggressively occupies the open 7th rank, attacking the pawn on h4 and preparing to contest the a-file, aiming to exploit black's exposed king and weakened pawn structure. This move aims to create a passed pawn on the h-file by pushing the pawn forward, potentially creating dangerous mating threats or forcing concessions from white.